Adjourned. Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I've called the debate today and been successful by the Speaker's office, following the shocking treatment of a group of residents in my constituency by their landlord recently, which has brought insecurities in the privately rented sector into sharp focus. In November last year, I was contacted by several residents living in a block of flats in Hornsey and Wood Green. After their building was sold to a new landlord, they had received either Section 21 notices evicting them or Section 13 notices saying that their rent was set to soar by an eye-watering 30 to 40%. These tenants included families who had lived for decades and were understandably devastated at the thought of losing their homes, and like me couldn't understand how increases on that scale could ever be justified, or how a landlord could kick out a reliable, long-standing tenant for no reason in the middle of a pandemic. I'm pleased to be able to say that following weeks of representations from my office to the new owners, the threat of adverse publicity in our local very campaigning newspaper, and with the help of the charity Shelter and local Hornsey Labour councillors, I've learned this week that the new owners have rescinded some of these notices and offered tenants new contracts on more favourable terms. However, whilst this is very welcome for most of these residents, sadly for some of them this change of heart by their landlords 2 months after the notices were dispatched has come about much too late. This example highlights the huge power imbalance between private landlords and their tenants, which is currently upheld through existing housing legislation, and it's why I'm urging the government to end Section 21 notices, as they committed to in their manifesto in the 2019 general election. I'm asking the Minister to provide an answer today on when the Renters Reform Bill, promised in the Queen's speech, will come forward to this House. And in this particular block of flats in my constituency, 7 households were issued with Section 21 notices, which enable private landlords to repossess their properties from assured short-hold tenants without having to establish fault on the part of the tenants. Hence, they're sometimes referred to informally as no-fault evictions. Many of these householders have lived in flats for several years, in some cases decades, and are raising their families there. One of the families, who have been issued with a Section 21 notice, had been renting their flat since 1991. They raised their daughter there, and now in their 60s cannot afford a mortgage, because in that period, of course, as the Minister will understand, the average price of purchasing a property in a place like Hornsey and Wood Green has skyrocketed. After challenging their landlord over the notice, they were told their only other option was to accept a 40% rent increase. One other resident whose family was issued with a Section 21 notice after living in the flat for 5 years explained that his family were left in an extremely difficult and precarious situation. And to make matters worse, these notices were issued in mid-November, with Section 21 notice recipients being expected to find a new home and move over the Christmas period, and in the midst of a global pandemic. When challenged on this, the new managing agent for the block said there's no good time to serve a Section 21 notice. He's right, but there are some very bad times, and that was one of them. Many other tenants in the blocks were issued with Section 13 notices, with rent rises of up to 40% with as little as 4 weeks' notice. One of these residents explained to me that when she moved into her flat as a single parent, she enjoyed the sense of community in the block, which is home to a number of families. The aggressive move taken by her landlord to increase her rent by 30% would have made it impossible to have paid the £2,000 per calendar month for a 2-bedroom flat in Hornsey. And the only recourse available to those who received the Section 13 notices is to refer them to a tribunal. However, this process can be lengthy, complex, time-consuming, and a waste of public funds, particularly for those struggling to gain access to expert advice. Moreover, there's nothing stopping landlords from subsequently issuing a Section 21 notice if the tribunal decision does not go in their favour. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, who has worked with tenants and landlords to develop a new and fairer tenancy model called the London Model, has called on the government to reform court processes to make it easier for renters to challenge rent increases and eviction notices, and he wholeheartedly supports my adjournment debate today. It's an injustice that any landlord, particularly given the Tory crisis with our budgets at the moment in terms of our household budgets, it's an absolute injustice that any landlord should be able to behave in this way. And when I contacted Shelter for advice, I was told that there's nothing to prevent private owners deciding to take possession, be it in a global pandemic, be it just on the eve of Christmas, and on a large scale like this. Living with that level of uncertainty can be detrimental to the well-being of our community. Shelter's survey of private renters in 2021 found that 39% of those surveyed said their housing problems or worries left them feeling stressed and anxious, and many parents have reported to Shelter that the insecurity of renting makes it harder for their children to settle, living in short, fixed-term contracts with a threat of eviction or an unaffordable rent hike looming makes planning for the future extremely difficult. Frequent moves are not only expensive but disruptive to employment and children's education, and the result of living in constant fear of eviction also makes renters less likely to report disrepair problems, which is an issue I see in my constituency, where 17,000 households are privately renting all too frequently. Shockingly, a quarter of privately rented homes do not meet the decent home standard, with 14% having a Category 1 hazard, posing a very significant safety concern to tenants. Whilst there are some actions the local authority can take to ensure landlords address the most serious disrepair, Citizens Advice has found that private renters who made a formal complaint to their local authority had a 46% chance of being served with an eviction notice within 6 months. This is a severe deterrent to reporting disrepair to the local authority. 11 million people, including 1 million children, are now living in rented accommodation. In the past, this was just a short-term option before one purchased a home or before one was able to get onto a housing list. Now, with 11 million people living in privately rented accommodation in the UK, this has become an urgent issue. The numbers expected to grow in the coming years, with 40% of London's households expected to be living in the privately rented sector by 2025. This is no way for the city's inhabitants to live. The last piece of comprehensive legislation affecting the privately rented sector was introduced in 1988, when the number was far lower. With a growing number of people across the country affected with their long-term housing situation, the need for the government to act is urgent. So number one, when will the Renters Reform Bill be brought to this House? And number two, when will the government live up to its promise to build more genuinely affordable homes? And by that I mean homes at the sorts of rents, like council rents, where people can actually afford to save while they're renting, so that if they wish to later, they can get onto the housing ladder. Everyone has the right to a safe and secure home, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yet it's shameful that 3 years after promising to end no-fault evictions, renters such as my constituency in Hornsey and Wood Green are still living with the fear of being made homeless by their landlord due to this government's failure to act. I urge the Minister to address these concerns and those which are shared by so many in my constituency across London and indeed across the UK, the 11 million people affected in the UK, in his remarks today. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Minister Eddie Hughes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to begin by congratulating the Honourable Member for Hornsey and Wood Green for securing this important debate on insecurity in the private rental market. In a country as great as ours, it should be a basic human right that people, regardless of whether they're homeowners, leaseholders or tenants, feel safe and secure in their own home. The Honourable Lady has touched on a number of issues which I'm sure are familiar to not just to myself and to my constituents, but to those of constituencies across the country. Because as she rightly pointed out, private rented sector is the second largest housing tenure in the country. 11 million people housed that way. In fact, 19% of people in the country live in the private rented sector. And it's also housing the most diverse range of people these days. The people living in the private rented sector are often older now and families rather than single people. And while it's a sector that continues to play a central role in providing housing across the country, it's a housing market that has undoubtedly left thousands of tenants feeling insecure and unprotected. But this doesn't need to be the case, and it shouldn't be the case. We as the government want to shift the odds in favour of renters and deliver a better deal for them. People across the country should be able to expect that when they're signing up to a rental agreement, that they will be protected from wrongdoing. There's still much to do for us to reach that point, but the action we're taking is going to improve the lives of people right across the country. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I stand here today, unfortunately, and as the Honourable Lady rightly pointed out, millions of responsible tenants are living in homes in the knowledge that they could be uprooted at a moment's notice and with minimal justification. That's not peace of mind, that's simply wrong. So to give people the confidence they need to be able to plan for the future, we're stepping up with the biggest change in legislation for the private rented sector for a generation by abolishing no-fault evictions, Section 21, as they are more formally known. This is the centrepiece of our plans to raise standards across the whole of the private rented sector and reflects our determination to drive out rogue and unscrupulous landlords. Our reforms are going to deliver a fairer, more effective rental market, and later this year we're going to publish the white paper that sets out the blueprint for the whole sector. I appreciate completely that the Honourable Lady is very keen for us to progress, but it's important, given this once-in-a-generation change, that we make sure that we've consulted widely with people from across the sector to ensure that we get it right. So in the meantime, you can be assured that we're not resting on our laurels. We are engaging with the widest possible range of voices, including stakeholders and organisations from across the sector. As much as we sometimes like to pretend, Madam Deputy Speaker, politicians don't always have the answers. And hearing and listening to these views will not only ensure that the white paper and future legislation actually addresses the challenges that exist, but also helps to create a system that works for everyone. Now, as part of a range of action to address the urgent and pressing needs of the generational pandemic that has arrived on our shores, we acted to keep renters safe in their homes. We banned bailiff evictions, we extended notice periods, and we provided unprecedented financial support to people and businesses. These measures worked. Fewer households were assessed as homeless, there are fewer rough sleepers today, and fewer possession claims are now being made in the courts. And we're going to make sure that Build Back Better is more than a slogan. As we recover from the pandemic, it's right that we do everything we can to improve the security of tenants in the private rented sector and learn the precious lessons from the interventions we adopted to make sure we deliver greater protection for tenants and empower them to hold their landlord to account. Honourable Lady is right to raise the issue of no-fault evictions. Currently, landlords can evict tenants with as little as 2 months' notice once their fixed-term contract has come to an end, without even needing to give a reason. The practical implication of this unjust situation is that the tenant can find themselves living with the worry that they may be evicted at the click of a finger. Other tenants continue to endure poor standards for fear that they'll be asked to leave if they complain about the problems within their home, as the Honourable Lady pointed out. This is why the government is committed to abolishing Section 21 of the Housing Act 1988. No longer will tenants find their landlord is evicting them on a whim, with no reason given as to why they have to relocate their lives or disrupt their children's education. In the future, landlords will always have to provide a specific reason for ending a tenancy, such as breach of contract or waiting to sell the property. And it will help to stop revenge evictions, where landlords may evict tenants who rightly complain about poor standards, once again as raised by the Honourable Lady. It will protect tenants from having to make frequent and short notice moves and enable them to put down roots and plan for the future. In 2019, we consulted the public on our proposed reforms to the tenancy framework and how we should take it forward. Around 20,000 people gave us their views, and we are listening. While we continue to drive forward work on sector reform, we also recognise that affordability concerns can cause insecurity for renters, and we're committed to tackling this. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's unfortunate to hear of issues that constituents have raised regarding rent hikes. Under the existing legislative framework, private sector landlords can increase the rent in two main ways. Firstly, during the fixed term period, any rental increases are set out in the tenancy agreement, allowing landlords and tenants to agree the arrangements that suit their circumstances. Secondly, once the fixed term has ended, and if the agreement transitions to a statutory periodic tenancy, a landlord is able to adjust the rent once a year under Section 13 of the Housing Act 1988. The landlord must serve a notice to the tenant informing them of the proposed change. If the tenant doesn't agree with the landlord's intention, they can refer the matter to the property chamber of the first tier tribunal for independent adjudication. The first tier tribunal will consider the application and decide what the maximum rent of the property should be if let on the open market, obviously considering the conditions of the local housing market. Tenants may also, of course, have a rent review clause in their contract. We are clear that it is for landlords and tenants to agree the amount of rent that should be charged at the outset of the tenancy. The government is, however, keen to avoid any unintended negative consequences related to abolishing Section 21. As part of this, we are clear that there should not be any mechanism for landlords to force a tenant to leave the property by including clauses in tenancy agreements which hike up the rent by excessive or unreasonable amounts before the agreement is due to expire. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, while 3/4 of private renters found it easy to afford their rent, we understand that affordability may be an issue for some and that they may require additional support. For tenants who are unable to afford their rental payments, there is a range of support available through the welfare system, alongside the unprecedented financial package supporting renters to afford their housing costs during the pandemic. This has meant that, even with the associated pressures of COVID-19, the vast majority of renters, in fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, 93% of them, are up to date with their rent, showing that the comprehensive package of support provided by the government is preventing widespread rent arrears as a result of COVID-19. So I hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we can all recognise that the government is steadfast in its commitment to build a private rented sector that works for everyone, one that introduces a better deal for renters and improves the lives of people across the country. A government that is pursuing reforms that will ensure good landlords can flourish and continue to provide the homes that the country needs. But also a government that is protecting tenants from sharp practice and removing criminal landlords from the sector. And one that is building back better from the pandemic. We're committed to rebalancing the relationship between tenants and landlords to deliver a fairer, more secure and more desirable private rented sector. And while this won't happen overnight, it will happen. We get it, the challenges that exist in this sector, and we're open to dealing with them. And that is why it's so important that we continue to drive through our reforms to ensure that we deliver on these aims. We're aware that we need to support the support of the entire private rented sector if we're going to achieve these goals. And it's in that spirit that I'd like to once again thank the Honourable Member for Hornsey and Wood Green for securing this important debate, and assure her that I intend to continue to drive through the government's ambitious programme of reform in the sector. Thank you.